Thank you for being here, and we are talking about regulations, which I assume in the room is everyone's very favorite topic to talk about and triggers immediate positive reactions if we talk about regulation. So I want to get us started off right away with taking the title of this event and seeing where we stand on whether this is a question or a statement. So Lyudmyla, I want to start with you. Regulations are not the solution. Is that a question or is it a statement? Where do you stand on the overall picture of this debate?
It's a complicated question. First of all, because if you don't have regulation, it's make your life difficult from some point of view. For example, if you're an NGO and you want to deliver humanitarian aid, if you want to support human rights in some countries. From other side, regulation can cause a problem because it can be abused, especially some moments, and then it makes you vulnerable. So it's difficult. You have to work with regulators so they know what has to be there.
Shortly, what is an instance in which regulation is abused? What does that mean in practice?
So imagine all of you have bank accounts, right? And imagine that your banking data, every day your transactions went to authoritarian regime who is angry on you. And what he did against you, he can organize smear campaign, he can attack and torture your relatives. He can organize criminal case against you and basically do everything about you. So at the end of the day, it can terminate, limit your access to your money. This is some examples what can happen with anti-money laundering regulation if it's abused by authoritarian states. And this is something what we present to regulators on our own example. This is not something abstract. It's happened to me. It happened to many activists from our coalition, and unfortunately, we have to deal with it.
So we'll get into anti-money laundering regulation a bit later in the conversation. Giacomo, I wanted to get you in here. Regulations are not the solution. I assume for you it's a statement.
No, I want to surprise you. It depends. So if we talk about, if we want to talk about fiat regulation, then I completely agree. They are very prone to abuse. Even when they are not abused for tyranny, they create corruption, exceptions, privilege. But there is also Bitcoin regulation. So right now, nation states and central bank are in a state of chaos and anarchy. They do a lot of bad shit. So regulation coming from Bitcoin is going to regulate nation states, and that's good because that's a property rights regulation and property rights enforcement. That's a natural law, which is a good kind of regulation. So if we talk about regulation by governments, that's not the solution, that's just a problem. If we talk about Bitcoin regulating governments, that's a bright future ahead.
So you're just flipping it around. We're flipping it around, who is regulating who ultimately. And so the premise, and this is where I want to get Jan into the conversation, the premise of our panel is that a certain subsection of regulation has created fake security for consumers, that they feel more secure with some of the exchanges such as FTX than they otherwise should have been. And I want to read you a quote. So this is Brian Armstrong, the Coinbase CEO, and he said recently, "Crypto regulation in the US has been hard to navigate, and regulators have so far failed to provide a workable framework for how these services can be offered in a safe, transparent way. This means that a swath of crypto-based financial products, including lending, margin trading, short selling, and other tools that are fully legal and regulated in traditional financial markets are all but outlawed in the US. Entrepreneurial teams building new decentralized products are afraid to build out of the US for fear of litigation. They don't want to break the rules, and right now they don't know what the rules are." Jan, do we need a type of bottom line for a regulatory framework for this industry to even develop? The Coinbase CEO seems to think so. So what do we actually need here? What is necessary?
Well, for me, regulation is a tool, nothing more. So it can help and it can also do a lot of damage. And it's really about the balance we strike here and what will be the costs and what will be the benefits. And about this fake feeling of security, that's true not only in the crypto area, but anywhere else. And still people have to really be smart about what they are putting their money into and really do their proper due diligence before they invest, because otherwise it's just their bad luck that they lose money.
The responsibility is on the end consumer to know what they're buying.
Definitely.
And so what do you tell, for your clients when you work at Deloitte, that regulatory uncertainty? How does that manifest itself in your conversations with your clients?
Well, I'm not surprised that the regulators are not keen about regulating Bitcoin because they don't have the qualification to understand the complexity. Just imagine how complex banking, insurance, or other financial services are, and they have been building the competence there for years or decades. Now Bitcoin is quite a new thing. They just were pretending it doesn't exist. So now they need to start building the competence, and it will take a lot of time. But it's only the competence that will make the dialogue possible. And in regulation, in Bitcoin or anywhere else, the progress and the technology is advancing at such pace that there is actually no regulation possible other than through a dialogue between the stakeholders and the regulator, that they just discuss what is being developed and how to regulate it properly.
But what kind of dialogue are we getting here? And that sort of comes down to sort of the educational level of those regulators. And I want to get in on that immediately here. Lyudmyla, you also had conversations with regulators. What education level do regulators currently even have? I remember the tech when the tech companies, social media companies were testifying, and there was a senator in the US Congress asking Facebook how they make money. Is that the level we're on? What do regulators know at this point?
In most cases, they really unaware what is it Bitcoin, how it operates, and this is where we come in and we say, guys, we use it for human rights, for social goods, for delivering humanitarian aid, where normal traditional financial institutions cannot work. And say, but explain, but we just actually come back from Czech Senate, and there was a question actually, so how you use Bitcoin, what is the difference? So, and of course we try to make it as simple as possible that, for example, we have people from Kazakhstan, from Russia, from Belarus. If you use traditional financial fundraising institutions, GoFundMe, Facebook, Patronate, it means that every single of your donor is going to be exposed with personal data immediately to special services of these regimes. It means that they are going to be sentenced to up to 17 years, can be tortured, can be fined. It's different kind of repressions. And the only solution in all of these regimes, the only tool, financial tool, what we can have right now, it's Bitcoin and stable coins. In most cases, it's Bitcoin anyways, because we can use unhosted wallets, which is our self-hosted wallets. We cannot use traditional financial institutions and crypto assets providers like exchanges, because again, you expose with all your data, just with all traditional financial institutions. So for us, the only way how we can deliver humanitarian aid, how we can explain to regulators, guys, we can do it in a safe way, not like carrying cash in our pockets and risking our life on the border. Actually, a lot of MPs doing this for a lot of NGOs and political prisoners to save them. And I say, next time, if you go to some weird country, you use Bitcoin, you don't use cash.
Maybe
it's safer.
Maybe you should have explained that to some of the people in the European Parliament with Qatargate. With Qatargate,
no,
they shouldn't have used cash.
Qatargate, it's actually interesting topic, because when it comes about such regimes like Qatar, Kazakhstan, Russia, they don't need to use Bitcoin or stable coins to corrupt people, because every transaction stays forever. And there is no that much capacity on the market to transfer billions, right? Immediately, everyone will understand it. But you can do it with diplomatic passport, with your private jet, with full cash in your bags, or with controlled national bank of Qatar or Kazakhstan. This is actually how Kazakhstan tried to avoid sanctions for Russia, helping Russia to circumvent sanctions.
Right, we'll still get on the sanctions point. Jan, I wanted to get your feedback here as well. The education level of regulators, what do you see?
Yeah, it's pretty low, and I'm not surprised, because they didn't want to create this fake idea of security, so they just took their hands off Bitcoin and the whole topic for the whole time.
What does pretty low mean? Can you give an example of a question you've gotten about Bitcoin that made you despair a little bit, maybe?
I haven't got any question, because they don't take questions.
Oh, they don't take
questions. Yes, this is the biggest problem.
There we go. Okay. Giacomo, any thoughts on the regulators?
Yes, I think that at the beginning, we may even profit in the short term from diseducation of the regulators. I mean, regulators in most cases are the attackers here in this scenario. Like in the history of mankind, I would say that the great majority of attacks on private property came from politicians and cops and governments in general. So they are the attackers. And security through obscurity can work for a while. So at the beginning, Bitcoiners, I think, took some interest into teaching regulators the wrong thing that were useful. For example, on privacy. We know that Bitcoin can be used privately. It's fairly simple to do it if you know how to do it. But for a few years, me included, we started to tell regulators, no, it's all completely traceable. It's all impossible to use privately. Everything stays there forever transparent, so we can know everything. Now, they really believed in our lie, so what they do is even imprisoning people that are innocent because they assume that all the chain analysis bullshit that we build up as a protected narrative is true, and there are scientific means to connect UTXOs together in a deterministic way, which is not the case. So I think the short term, we may even have profit into confusing regulators, like shitcoins in a way, like all the crypto environments, it's bad. It's mostly about pump and dump schemes, it's mostly Ponzi's, but can create a layer of decoy, of confusions around Bitcoin, so they don't know where to shoot. But long term, I think that clarity and truth are a more sustainable solution. Like security through obscurity doesn't scale over time. So right now, probably we have to tell the truth to our enemy, because otherwise they will start attacking even people that are not directly involved. So in the long term, probably the truth is the better strategy.
So we need better communicators ultimately. Is that
we need to teach our enemy how this weapon works.
Enemy, strong words right here.
I would not say enemy, actually, because we work with parliamentarians who are really support human rights. Of course, there are ignorant. There are different kind of politicians. All of them, first of all, human. The second, they have really little awareness about what is it, crypto assets, and specifically Bitcoin and stablecoin. They have little to nothing knowledge. So you need to educate them. So you have ignorant, you have those who perfectly understand what is it, but they want to keep it as their privilege, the same like banking system. And these people we have to expose, we have to work on it. And then you have third group of people who don't know much about Bitcoin and stablecoins, but they want to support human rights. They basically positive for financial freedom tools. They positive for encryption. And you need to work with them. You need to educate them. You need to meet with them just like we meet here and explain where is social good with all your argumentation. Because when you explain that, guys, you remember you support, for example, Navalny team, or you want to support Ukraine, or you want to support Belarus or other countries, Iranian, you can't send money. You, as MP, went with full of cash to support Iranian political prisoners. You have this diplomatic passport as a privilege that you are not going to be checked. You shouldn't do it. You can just use Bitcoin. And it's more safe. You can deliver humanitarian aid like it happened in Venezuela to many people, more than 60,000 of people in 1 month, regularly. And this is how it should be done.
Yeah, I'm a little bit, if I may just very quickly,
sure.
I'm a little bit skeptical about this strategy long term. Like in the short term, the good cop strategy can work, can protect people. You can get more, you can have better laws, you can have less strict enforcement. But in the long term, the problem I see is incentives. Like even a politician, let's say a US congressman that is very pro-Bitcoin right now, if Bitcoin works as intended from the monetary point of view, it will take away the possibility for the federal government to use the country loan tax, the inflation tax, to fund the federal government programs. So every congressman, if they are faced with the idea to lose, to get back to the federal budget, which is basically from 1915 or 1914, I think most of them, they will turn anti-Bitcoin. So short term, the good cop can probably work. Long term, I'm more skeptical, unless we are talking with some country, some nation state that has more to gain than to lose. For example, if you talk with Panama, I don't know, just an example, they don't care much for inflation. They don't even have money to inflate. They care just for the canal revenue, so they don't need the country loan tax. So for them, Bitcoin can be an ally. For the United States as a federal entity, Bitcoin is clearly the natural enemy. So I think that eventually they will be the natural predator. So we can use a short-term friendly approach, but I think we should expect most of the politicians in most first world countries to eventually turn against Bitcoin because their career is made out of control, censorship, surveillance, and inflation. And Bitcoin is basically going to take that away to an extent.
Well, if I may interject here, is your bottom line here that can government and Bitcoin even coexist? Is there a scenario in with that?
Probably, but with a budget for warfare and welfare, which is close to the one of the beginning of the 20th century, which is not what most politicians will want. And the second risk, sorry if I go too long, but then I stop. The second risk
I'll give you another minute here
okay,
to just finish your thought.
So this is the risk of the counterparty turning against you. The other risk is yourself as a lobbyist. You start advocating for some space of freedom, but then if they give you there is regulatory capture, basically. For example, there are a lot of crypto lobbying firms that they get some privilege for their funding companies. So Coinbase is sponsoring this let's say advocacy firm. They get some privilege for Coinbase, and then they will just allow this local privilege, just like the East Indian company, some kind of restricted privilege. So eventually, the incentives are against lobbyists to stay honest. It's very hard for a lobbyist to stay honest to the cause, in my opinion.
Very briefly, I do want to move on to Micah. Let's
sure, but politicians are not gods. Politicians are not from other planets. And regulation is a tool. And you have a privilege. You live in democratic countries. If you live in authoritarian countries, you have no this privilege. You pay your life to change regulation. Here, you have a privilege to organize yourself and to work with them and to find solution. Short-term, long-term, it's up to you to work on it. In other countries, you just don't have this privilege. You don't have privilege to use anything. So use your vote, use your dialogue with politicians, and shape your regulation.
Why not both? Bad cop, good cop, we work together.
Absolutely.
Well, let's bring it back to sort of what we have in terms of the regulatory front, and I want to get Jan back in, who didn't participate in this little exchange here. I want to talk about Micah. Micah, we're looking at probably next year coming into force. Mm-hmm. Some regulators, some lawmakers call it the most comprehensive to date existing regulatory framework for crypto assets, is what they call it. Your thoughts on Micah? Is this the silver bullet? Does this help your clients understand sort of what the rule base is, or are we just at the beginning here?
Yeah, there are threats and opportunities. I would say the opportunity would be that this will open the doors for like venture capital or retail to invest into crypto because the rules will be predictable and there will be some supervision. On the other hand, of course, it can do the damage to the very nature of Bitcoin as a decentralized coin.
And how would it do that? Run us through this. Like how will that happen?
Well, actually, any regulations works in a way that once the red line is crossed, that something starts to be regulated, it only grows. So we cannot expect any time in the future the regulation just to scale back. It will only demand more and more. And of course, the amount of compliance which we now see is applicable to banks or traditional players is too much of a burden now even for them. So I can imagine that for players on the crypto market, this will become more and more difficult to operate.
So market entry barriers are a factor here. Do you see it as a good or a bad thing that that the European Union as such creates a regulatory framework here, or would you rather see that member states compete on which one is more attractive?
No, of course, it's the European Union who have more experience. They can create this European market where you can operate on a scale of 500 million people, which is great, under the same rules, and expand.
Lyudmyla, Micah, a breath of fresh air after the regulatory Wild West, or what do you think?
For us, it was, first of all, as for end users, a question of data protection, right? It was a question, are we capable to use Bitcoin and stablecoins in a safe way like we used before regulation? And this is the reason why we met with over 100 of members of European Parliament, explaining that the crypto assets providers shouldn't be exposed for all of these abuses of anti-money laundering regulation or transfer of funds regulation. like it was in with traditional financial institutions like banks or any kind of payment system or even fundraising platforms. The second issue for us, what was very important, and I hope it's going to be in a positive direction, and anyways, they're quite difficult discussion, it's about environmental impact, because as human defenders, as end users of Bitcoin, you should not be associated with something bad. And we know all that in media, in mainstream media, it's very negative publicity for Bitcoin in an environmental aspect, and basically that it's only for speculation and there is no social use. So again, with all of our advocacy mission in European Parliament, we try to basically debunk all of this fake accusation and ask regulators to give us space to use unhosted wallets, self-hosted wallets, because this is the only option to operate, especially with authoritarian countries. To protect our data, actually, when some regime fabricate criminal case against us or organize, smear campaign in different languages against us. So we should be protected. Our bank account or our crypto assets account shouldn't be terminated. And we have all of these provisions. So we think it's huge success, but both MiCA and both anti-money laundering regulation, it has such many windows of opportunity how to overregulate it, and with all of this competition. So now what was established framework of MiCA and also anti-money laundering regulation, we see, for example, members from UK, Canada, US, they perceive it as too liberal regulation. So they compete. After a meeting of G7 in Japan, they compete who is going to overregulate, for example, peer-to-peer transactions or unhosted wallets, or, for example, basically operation with crypto assets providers. So for us, it's a new stage of fight, because what we achieved here, which is positive for us as end users, now is under risk because other regulators want to put pressure on you.
So we've opened the floodgates. Giacomo, can we close them again?
With the final battle, Bitcoin versus the funding the states, yes, but in the short term, probably it's just going to be worse and worse. So I'm a little bit schizophrenic about this regulation, because on one side, it's clearly bad, like Bitcoin is speech. It's regulating math. Do you know a very large number? That's the question. I want to regulate the fact that you know a large number, that you know how to do elliptic curve math. That's crazy. You cannot regulate that. But on the other hand, these kind of attacks will happen, and it's better if they happen sooner than later, because otherwise the system will grow weak, not anti-fragile. People will get lazy, they will get used to convenience of KYC, AML, centralized institution, and when they will be hit harder. It's like when you have a baby, you don't want the baby to eat garbage from the streets, you want to protect him, but you don't want him to live in a bubble, otherwise he will never develop an immune system. So people in Europe, they have been trained to just trust the centralized exchanges and give their personal data away for KYC. So the fact that some regulation is bad, but some bad things must happen sooner than later, otherwise it's too late.
It sounds like an accelerationist argument to me.
It is, and it's in a way, so it's bad, but it's good that some bad things are happening. So we can fight back, we can get, like Vexel is something that without any regulator, if Kraken was left able to do KYC-free stuff, then Vexel will not develop. But Kraken will be easy to shut down, and Vexel will be harder, and even RoboSats and BSQ will be even harder to shut down. So good times create weak tools, and bad times create strong tools, and we need strong tools because bad times will arrive.
And what are we expecting going forward, Jan? In your view, there's a payment services directive in the EU, and then very quickly we had PSD2, a second payment services directive. There will be a third one. Is MiCA going to be the same thing, where every few years we're just going to add more regulation on top because there's always outliers that need to be regulated even further? Do you see that this is sort of because you mentioned that now we're just on the growth projection for
Yeah,
regulatory.
yeah. But some of that regulation can actually make things easier and democratize them in a way that it will break up some monopolies. Like
Give us an example.
Like in payment services, because now you really need to have an account to be able to trade in a fiat currency, to have it open with a bank, because only banks here have access to the clearing system and can send money to each other. And of course, if the banks just kind of agree that they will not operate bank accounts for Bitcoin traders, then you just won't be able to exchange money in fiat and send them between each other. So when the new regulation opens the market, the clearing system for new players like payment services providers other than the banks, then this can democratize things. And of course, these accounts and these services can be more accessible for players on a Bitcoin market.
So it's providing legitimacy, is that your view as well?
Yeah, actually, because what we ask from regulators, from European Parliament, but also from national parliament, that we need to have a bank of last resort, because we need to be able to have, for example, donations and the kind of transfer of funds actually from fiat to Bitcoin and back without being unbanked, because a lot of organizations, because a lot of individuals, companies, just because they were using crypto assets provider services, they were deprived the right to have traditional financial services, so bank account. And now it's fixed with upcoming anti-money laundering regulation. But again, there are so many provisions which I see a lot of risk, honestly, and we have to work on them so it would not damage us, but actually be on our side.
And so this is for the round, and in just one word, the regulators who seek to use regulation to restrict the use of Bitcoin, those people, describe them in one word. We'll start with you, Lyudmyla.
Unaware. They're just unaware. They don't know anything about Bitcoin.
Giacomo?
Wrecked, if we act correctly.
Jan?
I think it's naive.
Life?
Naive.
Naive. Sorry. Yes, naive. Okay, well then we have some qualifications there to send them over to the regulators. I wanted to jump to something which Lyudmyla alluded to, which is the environmental impact, the energy use. That this is something that regulators do care about quite a bit. So Giacomo, I wanted to get you in on this issue. It seems that for now, the EU regulations don't touch on this issue. There were amendments that would have had significant impact, but those didn't happen, probably because of the work of Lyudmyla and others. But is Bitcoin now off the hook, or is this coming back?
I don't think so. I mean, the environmental excuse to hurt the technology, to hurt entrepreneurship, to hurt people and take their money is a very huge pretext. It's used for everything, taxation and any kind of restriction, together with health excuses or terrorism or for a Patriot Act. So it's one of the pillars of state intervention. So I think we will still, of course it's crazy because like a Tesla car is using electricity, so it is green. A Bitcoin ASIC is using electricity, so it's polluting. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. So it's purely a pretext, but I think we will see more of it. But again, like I was saying before, there is another aspect of this. This is bad, but for example, if you don't have any crackdown on regulated mining, then economies of scale may create a huge mining central monopolies that then will be vulnerable to attack by nation states. If you do have mining, not just taxation, but imagine a mining ban in the US, that does decentralize mining a lot. Like in China, you still have 30% of the hashing power and it's completely decentralized, it's completely off the grid, completely decentralized. It's possible to find mining farms with active investigations, but it's very hard to hit them, and they're like a hydra. You kill one and another pops up. So regulation, so Bitcoin feeds from stress, from attacks. It's just that if it's too much of a stress too soon, it will kill the baby. If it's too late, it will make the baby fat and lazy. So, I mean, the US banning Bitcoin for environmental bullshit is probably something that will help Bitcoin in the end.
Jan, do you see it in the same way as the environmental argument now that we talk about significant packages for environmental control? The EU has the European Green Deal. The US is moving in similar directions. Will this be the ultimate threat to Bitcoin?
Well, the whole ESG policy in EU is based on the customer's choice. So basically, it does not prohibit anything. It just becomes more and more expensive. Well, you can operate a coal power station, but just the coal power station won't get financing or cheap financing from the banks or from the market. So at the end of the day, it will just disappear because it will be too expensive. So I think that the resources which will not be green will just fade away if this is the customer's choice, if they really prefer to have things green, and they will just issue some pressure on Bitcoin being mined in a green way, or as green as possible.
So we'll eventually have ESG compliant Bitcoin and others, or what does that mean in practice?
Well, yeah, if the customers wish so, and if the providers will have to report in an ESG compliant way how much of green or not green resources they use when they provide their services, then the customers may look at the charts and just make their choice.
Lyudmyla?
So I see there a clear point how actually we should expect attack for Bitcoin, for example, from perspective of energy crisis, because it's easy to excuse from themselves that, you know, we have this Bitcoin, everyone is speaking about it negative in media. So it's easy to politicians to blame Bitcoin to find solution, which is absolutely, of course, ridiculous. And this is the reason why, again, we have to make awareness, educate them, so all this propaganda will be destroyed. The most one of the biggest questions what we receive from regulators is actually how you feel about it. You know, Bitcoin mining is provoking in Europe energy crisis, and then step by step we explain that no one is mining Bitcoin with traditional energy supplies. If you do it in it, it's only with energy sources, and then it's basically change their absolutely perspective. Then they see opportunities. So it's about how you able to deliver your message, what's your argumentation if you meet with these regulators.
Do you take credit for those amendments in MiCA being removed?
Of course, with us we had Obin Vosu, who showed every time on his phone how he actually mined Bitcoin in Africa with hydro. We brought with us guy from Ireland who said how he used actually Bitcoin mining from farm, you know, from all of this stuff. So we have numbers, solar. So we have number example, and we debunked it on a practical, not just kind of virtual accusation, but you will say with arguments, and they are people, politicians, they are just like us. If you say with argumentation, with numbers, they have no knowledge, you know? You can easily debunk it.
And so, well, you mentioned this, and a lot of this is about feeling. Regulators also and politicians also act according to, you know, their preconceived perceptions. The media plays a role, the way that Bitcoin is portrayed. And I wanted to get something from Giacomo here. You have a talk on Saturday, which is entitled Bitcoin Ordinals Are Retarded. So to tease us a bit for Saturday, do you think Bitcoin Ordinals might actually be an example of something that might give Bitcoin a bad reputation and fuel regulators to...
So I will try to explain. Ordinals is a big umbrella name for a new trend that includes also the so-called inscriptions, which is basically writing random data on the time chain, on Bitcoin's time chain. So that may open up some other legal attack surface for Bitcoin, because many governments rule some kind of data as illegal. Of course, sometimes they exaggerate. For example, in the US, for some years, there were illegal numbers. So if you have a T-shirt with a number that was encoding, for example, like Adam Beck, who is somewhere here, used to give away T-shirt with illegal numbers in the 90s during the crypto wars. But even now, there are illegal images, of course, and you can imagine which kind. There may be copyright infringement and stuff like that. So if you can write a lot of data on the time chain, every Bitcoin node, which is not pruned, will host potentially illegal image, illegal videos, illegal song, from the point of view of copyright infringement or worse. So I think that ultimately that doesn't matter because Bitcoin was created to survive government censorship. So if you run a Bitcoin node, you have the tool to survive any kind of of government censorship. But of course, it's better to be persecuted less than more. So to be persecuted for copyright infringement is different than from like a way worse kind of accusation. So and there already is a lot of, or let's say, blasphemy for Islamic countries. Do you run a Bitcoin node in an Islamic country? There are Islamic blasphemy sentences encoded somewhere in the time chain. So it opens an attack surface, but it was inevitable. People doing that are assholes, but it was in the game theory, and we will have to defend ourselves.
Opening up a whole new can of worms, and you can listen to Giacomo's talk on Saturday on that topic. And we have a couple of minutes left, and I wanted to talk briefly about the news for those that want to get in on this on the panel. We had news, this week, regarding Binance and Coinbase facing significant pushback from the SEC, customer funds allegedly also being used to fund a private yacht. In the case of Binance, a lot of this is alleged, and we don't know all the information, but how does that play into sort of what European regulators might do with crypto with the crypto markets regulation in the future?
Yeah, basically, I guess it shows that even if there is no regulation intended specifically for Bitcoin and crypto assets, then as the scale becomes bigger and bigger, and you are more and more in retail market, and you are trading on a scale, then it's almost inevitable that you escape the eye of the regulator, because there will just happen the cases of fraud and others where the people will just be on the newspaper and will claim that they were deceived. And this is just a very difficult situation for regulators and politicians, and they are just forced to intervene.
Well, let me push back on this, because this, to me, it sounds a bit like people don't have agency, and just because there's absence of regulation doesn't mean you should defraud people. So, I mean, what does that, I mean, to me, this feels a bit like this whole space is full of fraudsters just willing to use any loophole in a regulatory space. Is that what we're dealing with?
No, definitely not. It's just that these individual cases are so much louder and visible than 99% of those transactions that went okay, that it just creates a false incentive, I would say, for the regulators to intervene.
Lyudmyla, are Binance and Coinbase ruining it for everyone?
I mean, for me, regulated exchanges, it's always kind of difficult, from perspective as a human defender, because we always very uncomfortable using them. All of our data is exposed, right? And it's always was abused. So with regulation, we have at least some room how to impact on the situation. But again, if it's used to destroy industry, of course, it shouldn't be like this. So this is, again, why I'm encouraging people to speak with regulators, to frame your regulation, not allowing to destroy yourself, because I'm not agree a little bit with
Giacomo.
Sorry. That you can just receive benefits. Coinbase and Binance, they did a lot of advocacy in US, and you see where it ends. So
Coinbase kind of did. Coinbase kind of did some advocacy effort in the US.
They did. Yeah, they've done a lot. But you see, they impacted quite a lot. They damaged right now. So it's again. You need to be in capacity to explain everything what you are doing and shape this, with end users. I mean, we can of course go in a separate, we fighting for our rights as end users of Bitcoin, and industries doing by themselves. But actually, when we are together, we're stronger. We actually can shape this regulation, which serves both for us and for you guys.
So I think that realities like Coinbase are absolutely a net negative for Bitcoin. They promoted a lot of Ponzi schemes and frauds. They tried to attack Bitcoin directly, pushing users to install BTC1 implementation, the broken one that would have killed the network. They overcomplied with the IRS, hitting some innocents. They hired a espionage company called Neutrino, former hacking team that was spying on civilians in Saudi Arabia as their internal compliance team. So they are absolutely a bad actor. So I understand why some Bitcoiners are cheering for the SEC to shut down bad actors like Coinbase that are definitely a net negative. But I disagree, because I think that the reason that the scam industry, which is called crypto, even exists is mostly because of financial regulators. My thesis is that most poor people, not qualified investors, could not participate to the stock market, tech stock market explosion. So they wanted to invest in technology. They cannot save in money because money will be inflated away. So they need investment to save, and they need technology, which is the only kind of growth. So they were forced into illegal security because they were prevented from buying normal legal security. Also, the regulation pushed companies to be obscure about what they do, because since they don't want to be forced into complying with very expensive like KYC, AML, and qualified investor, SEC, or in Europe, FINMA, or whatever, so they have to put out a lot of crypto woo or blockchain woo, like fake stuff in order to confuse the regulators, which is fine. But in the process, it's also easy to confuse the investor. So the regulation created the crypto scam industry in a way. So regulator cannot solve it. Market will solve it, and education will solve it, and sufferance and pain will solve it.
Very harsh words. We have...
On a positive note.
Well, and that's where I want to end it, because we have very little time left, and I want to give everyone just a very brief moment to explain how optimistic or pessimistic they are about the future. If we have this panel in 10 years, what conversations are we going to be having then? So Giacomo, I'll just let you finish off your thought there. Are you pessimistic?
No, I'm not. I've never been more optimistic in my life than since I met Bitcoin, and more optimistic every year. So Bitcoin resisted a lot of attempt to capture it, to distort it, to corrupt it, and it's getting harder to change and harder to stop every year. And the new generation of people like this, in this conference, I see some very old friends, but a lot of new people, and it's orange pilling people about the nature of money, the nature of freedom of transaction, the nature of inflation. So I'm super optimistic.
Jan, any conclusion? Any conclusions there from you for what we're going to be seeing in the future?
I'm also optimistic, because I think what the regulators were missing so far from Bitcoin was the data, some history on which they could learn how things work. And I think that over the time they will see that Bitcoin just works as any other sort of asset or investment asset, and that it has to be taken like that. And also by being used by more and more people, it will become familiar to everyone, and it will not be that odd, strange thing.
Thank you, Jan. Lyudmyla, you get the final word.
Absolutely, I'm also positive for many reasons, but one of the reasons, and I'm pretty sure that in 10 years everyone is going to defend Bitcoin, like now regulators defend an end-to-end encryption. Remember, before it was only used by criminals and extremists, so this was accusation. Now regulators say that we have to protect end-to-end encryption and make more regulation for surveillance tools. And this is where we have to come together with for Bitcoin. So every regulator has to understand that he has really his own interest to protect Bitcoin, because it's his freedom also.
Thank you so much to the panel for this fascinating discussion, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.